So let's go on with where we broke off. You wanted to say something about the lymphoma.
Yes. Okay. So from the very once that CAT scan was seen by Corey Weinstein, who's the doctor that's being consulted, a recommendation was sent, and this is all referenced in the current the lawsuit that's pending, that in fact there be testing for non-Hodgkin's. Let me just read it here. For non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that was based on these. Lymph nodes that were shown. Yes, it's to look. He said that it's important to look for an occult malignancy workup to do that,
yes,
to determine the cause of the still present severe rash, as it was indicative of T-cell lymphoma. And that is, they did do a biopsy at SCI Mahanoy. It was done by staff there. Which I'm speaking now, for myself, that this is not acceptable. That this type of test done, however it can be done technically by a tech person, is not the way we want Mumia treated. We
yes,
want him taken care of in the best medical care, like they do for those the 1%, as they say, and even
right,
the 1% in the United States has to fight to get good medical care. I would argue an event,
yeah.
but the point is that this was not acceptable. And then we heard, or Mumia heard, some previous that biopsy that was done, which apparently because of his skin, if you see it, his skin, the layers of his skin and those scabs and everything were so thick that they had to really go way down deep to do the skin biopsies, yes, and it required sutures afterwards, and it was apparently, quite uncomfortable and painful.
All of this sounds pretty horrible.
Yes, and so he had that done at Mahanoy. We heard that the results of those biopsies were negative for lymphoma. But again, anyone who's being treated or being tested for cancer of any sort knows better than to accept one negative. You're happy. You're happy relieved for a second, but unless you're really foolish, you're not going to accept one. If you're
clear-sighted, you will want more.
Exactly. And so in any event, they switched. So that's what we knew earlier on. So then they took him to Geisinger. And as we understand from Mumia, they did a whole series of tests. I don't have a formal anything that hasn't been released yet, but they did an endoscopy. They did a colonoscopy.
Yes.
Mumia, they did, of course, echograms and stuff. They did they did everything to test just about every organ, as far as I can tell.
At least sounds better.
Yes, I think that is better.
They did a lot more.
Exactly. You want more, and this is a better facility, so one would hope that it was done in a better way. Mumia said they also did other biopsies. They had to do two. One, apparently they didn't take enough tissue to actually do a good reading, and they had to do a second. Now, where these biopsies were under his arms, to the lymph nodes under his arms. I don't need to say what that means.
Sure.
Okay, so that's where they did those biopsies, and there's not a report on those back yet.
Right.
And then the other thing Mumia said is what they did is to deal with his skin condition, which sounds like in some ways, it would continue to be just as bad. It was not better at all. Is they, for 4 days, for every 4 hours, he said, whether it was the middle of the night or whatever, he was covered in a cream, Aristocort, which you should just look it up yourself, Aristocort. It's for all sorts of dermatitis and
yes,
but it does indicate that its first use is to check for lymphoma.
Okay.
And they they covered him with this, and they wrapped him like a mummy, sort of, with the cream. And they did this for 4 days. And then afterwards, they started putting Vaseline on him to help clean the skin away and everything. Yes. And so,
did the skin condition get better after that?
He looks, okay. Wadiya and I saw him on Thursday. This Thursday. And compared to what he looked like before, he's much better in the way he looks compared to what he looked like before. Of course, if you were to see him and not have seen him before, you would see a man who looked very ill. And his face, the most dramatic change is his face is much better. His clear, all that stuff on his neck and his ears are cleared up. His skin no longer is like alligator skin. I mean, that's how I viewed it, looked at it. That's what it looked like. So it's not that way now, but it is raw. And it's, again, if you do a close-up of and I have the original of those photos from there. So if you want to do it through the camera, you might get it, or I'll send you a scan of it and do it. It actually, if you look at it closely.
Send it to me separately.
I'll send it to you separately in a scan. And I think you'll see that he's not well. And his hands are still very swollen. His fingers are like translucent. Mm-hmm. If you've seen somebody with really swollen hands where the skin is so tight, and his feet are still very swollen, and the bottom of his feet are still wrapped, because, in fact, they were very cut up. So cut up from the scabs and the peeling and things like that. So he is better in that way, but there's still no diagnosis.
Yes,
and he's back in the hospital infirmary.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask. Let me make the link to the second part about the lawsuit. One of the contentious things that was struggled over was not just medical condition, but the ability of outside visitors, including his lawyer and lawyers, to see him. Can you say something about that?
Well, in fact, the legal action is primarily brought to get access to Mumia, primarily by his lawyers, and then also by Wadiya in particular and other family members. In the United States, lawyers and access to lawyers here is a special legal right that very often is stronger in law in the United States than the right of immediate family to see somebody when they're incarcerated. And the legal action that was brought was an emergency basis, primarily for the lawyers to be able to get access to him, to be able to discuss what is happening and the question about filing the lawsuit, etc. So Wadiya also, and the fact that she submitted an affidavit as part of that, indicating that she is the spouse. They have these 8 children together and the grandchildren, and he has been a parent to these children from inside the walls of prison, and she is the authorized person to get the medical records for him, and that she wanted access to him as well.
What would be the normal procedure when a prisoner is hospitalized and dangerously ill? Is there precedent on that? Can family members see the prisoner under such a condition? The way these things work, there's the U.S. constitutional rights, and then there are each state, and then you have also what the reality is, of course. So I'm just saying when we began between, when somebody is critically ill, deathly ill, they think they're going to die, the prisons, I would say, as a general rule, will allow the family members to come in to say their last goodbyes. In terms of the rights of access, these are determined by some balancing act that they consider between security issues and constitutional rights.
And the right of access to attorney, is, as I said, is actually a very strong right. And the fact that there would not be even a phone call allowed, let alone a visit, is really, I think, should be quite clearly unconstitutional under any circumstances. And that is what the argument, clearly was. In terms of family, there is a right for family to have access, particularly a spouse, because marriage is considered to be a fundamental right under the United States Constitution, and that's part of all the gay rights question comes under this sort of unspecified but inherent right of marriage, and how whether or not that can be infringed upon by state officials. So within that framework, now I'm being very legalistic here now, within that framework, the wife does have some rights, but not supreme rights, and especially since they consider, and under the U.S. Constitution, a prisoner doesn't have the same rights as everybody. They have some rights, but not every right. And the rights that they have can be very much restricted by the prison based upon their own security conditions. And just a little bit on American constitutional history, when the 13th Amendment was passed, and, after the defeat of the South in the Civil War and defeat of slavery, it has a proviso in it, which I'm sure seemed totally normal at that time, which says, what I can just read it right here. I have it out here for you here. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So, in other words, involuntary servitude as an imprisonment after being convicted of a crime is perfectly constitutional, and it's been used in many ways.
At which time they had to invent lots and lots of new crimes like littering and loitering and just being there.
Right. Or that existed at the same time. And, so in any event, the point is that a prisoner is not considered to have every right, but they are considered to be able to have some rights. They're not allowed to be retaliated against. For instance, and this affects Mumia a whole lot and is really a segue to a lot of these points about Mumia, is that you can do all sorts of things to a prisoner that a court will not overturn, that one would think should be not allowed.
Yes.
But if you do that in retaliation for their speaking out about something or their act in something that is nominally their right to do, then that is actually prohibited. And that is part of the reason or the legal background to why Mumia is probably one of the few prisoners in the United States that has a constitutional right to publish. And it has been it's stated by Court of Appeals,
because
Federal
at
Court
that
of Appeals.
time the court said this is retaliation and we don't allow this.
Exactly. That was the underlying, wasn't just a First Amendment right, but that his First Amendment rights were being infringed on in retaliation.
What is your take on this terrible mistreatment medically since January and maybe before? Would you also consider that as retaliation for Mumia speaking out?
Yes, exactly. You know exactly where I was going. Yes, exactly. I mean, on the one hand, this is everything about Mumia's case. It is both a very particular case of the state going after this man for who he is and what he stands for, and being viewed, I believe, as the face of Black revolt in the United States. But it is also the story of every prisoner. Both things exist at the same time. So in terms of medical mistreatment, I would say that by definition, if you're a prisoner in the United States prisons or any state prisons anywhere, you're going to be medically mistreated. Now, that's just also part of the American legal medical situation and class society in America. I mean, there's no medical care that's decent so it's part and parcel of the whole thing. Now, in Mumia's case,
and also you have things in the United States that you have almost nowhere in the world. Considering, for example, that Mumia has been in jail for 33 years, or talk about Leonard Peltier, with
Right.
whom it will soon be 40 years, or Hugo
Right.
Grinnell, and you name it.
Yes, right.
You don't have that elsewhere in the world.
That's the nature of the American legal system, which has everything to do with the nature of American capitalism, which rests on the legacy of slavery and the black question in America. And it has, these things are all tied together. It's why there's still capital punishment in the United States. It's why there is such the enormous amount of lifers who are lifers. And of course, the war on drugs, which led to
Yes.
the immense, extreme explosion of the number of people, primarily or disproportionately black and Hispanic men being incarcerated in this country. And that has everything to do with American capitalism resting on legacy of slavery.
1 million mostly nonviolent offenders on that charge alone.
Right, exactly. There's estimated over, depending upon the estimates, 100,000 people in prisons, in different prisons around the country, solitary confinement. You have actually innocent people that are there. They're estimated over 100,000. These are people who are factually innocent. I'm not talking about, again, the hundreds of thousands of people who are in there for things that shouldn't be crimes, like drug offenses. And I could go on and on.
Exactly, I see. Let's get briefly back to the two lawsuits. So the last lawsuit is mainly about visiting rights, right?
Yes, but it does have a component to it which talks about the fact that there is medical mistreatment. It has the history of things in there, but that was not the primary. There will be an expanded complaint, I'm sure, that will deal with that and ask for more in terms of what's going to be done in terms of Mumia's medical care.
Yeah, and this is litigated, as I understand it, before the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. Is that right?
It's in that jurisdiction. It's in the federal court, the lower level, district court.
The lower level, the district court.
The district court. It's right now in the district court. And the judge that is assigned to the case is somebody who, I think he was flabbergasted in the conference call that was had with the DOC attorney as well as Mumia's attorneys, where the DOC attorney didn't even want to acknowledge that where Mumia was at the time they had this conference call. It was on Tuesday afternoon. At that point, Mumia had actually been transferred back to Mahanoy, but we didn't know that. In fact, Wadiya was on the phone with the infirmary at about 2:00, and she was told, well, you can't talk to Steinhardt right now because he's doing a medical emergency. She got him at 3:30, and he still didn't say he was there. We only learned later that at 2:00, this medical emergency was Mumia being transferred back to Mahanoy.
I see. Yeah.
Just lied about. But going back to the DOC, they wouldn't even tell the judge where Mumia was. Judges...
Wasn't the judge livid?
Yes, he was. Judges, it's okay. Judges are not necessarily offended by the state lying to other people.
Yes.
Except when they lied to them, they get pretty pissed off. So he couldn't believe that because in part of the argument was the need to get immediate access to Mumia, and if he was back at Mahanoy, then the prison was not going to withhold visitation or phone calls so long as it didn't interfere with any treatment by Mumia, which he doesn't have that type of treatment while he's there, so he can have visits.
And the target of the lawsuit is the DOC. Right?
It's the DOC, and it's the particular prison and the infirmary and all those things too. So it goes down the whole level of things, but it's against the DOC, yes.
And what was the first step of the judge?
The first step of the judge was to schedule this proceeding, and as far as I know, there has been no decision by the judge. At this point, he made it clear. Let's say the DOC wanted the judge just to dismiss the lawsuit out of hand because once Mumia was back in Mahanoy, the issue of access wasn't on the table anymore. But the argument was made, correctly, of course, that in fact this was going to come up again. Mumia might very well be transferred to another hospital, and the DOC would play this game. And the judge agreed that this was something that he was going to take up and decide. So right now, there's still no decision on that, and there's no immediacy because Mumia is back in Mahanoy. So the next question is what's going to be done next about the lawsuit to argue more in terms of the medical care that Mumia should get and how to proceed with that, and that's all under discussion.
Is there any idea about the time frame when the judge will decide on these matters?
Well, the only matter really in front of him right now that's really real for him because of the way the pleadings were and the emergency nature is whether or not he's going to rule that if Mumia gets transferred to another hospital, that the DOC has to allow some contact. So there's no urgency, and therefore the judge didn't do anything. I don't think anything will happen on that until there's a more fully formulated, full-blown lawsuit that's filed that deals with things. Now, I will say that given going back to your question of retaliation and everything, I believe that I would like to see, I don't know if it will happen, that there is an action made in the course of this lawsuit that says not only do we think Mumia needs quality medical care, and that needs to be done under the direction of his own doctors and at facilities that of his choosing, even with his willingness to pay for it. But I do believe an argument should be made that that there's no way that Mumia can get adequate medical treatment under the aegis of the DOC, and that furthermore, he's been in prison for 33 years, and everything that's done to him is retaliatory, and that therefore the only remedy that should be granted is he should be released from prison. Now that is an out-of-the-box legal argument.
Yes.
But I do think, and I hope that that argument is made, because I believe it is important, as you know, I think every activist involved in this case right now is saying that the only way Mumia's life is going to be saved, and he's going to live out his life in some way that is gives him a chance of living out his life, is to be released from prison.
It very much sounds like a sound and logical argument, and we are converging on that here.
I think politically speaking, regardless of what's said in the legal papers in the end, that argument needs to be made because of all the understanding of what the nature of Mumia's case is, the retaliation against him. If you look at the timeline, too, by the way, this law was passed in October. The lawsuit challenging it was brought about 20 days later in November, and it was pending and being fought during this whole period of time. And in fact, interestingly enough, most of the establishment bourgeois press was even saying, look at guys, we don't like Mumia, we think he's a stone cold killer, and blah, 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 all those things. But you know what, this law is really this law is out of line. Yes. And so it was not getting any support from where it should, and I believe that Ed Rendell...
I was kind of flabbergasted. When I was in Philadelphia in February, I wrote to that guy who has been with the Daily News for 30 years, Stu Bukowski, who is certainly a Mumia hater.
Yes, you're right.
When he commented on that law, he said, I hate to say it, but this time I have to support Mumia because this is just rubbish.
Right, exactly. And it's notable, I want to make this point, that Ed Rendell was not part of the applauding of this law being passed. He was not there when it was being signed. He gave no statement in support of it. And Ed Rendell shares a major responsibility for Mumia's prosecution, coordination with the Justice Department during the trial to suppress evidence that would have been useful for Mumia, overseeing his conviction, death sentence, etc. And not only that, but I believe Ed Rendell was part of the deal that was made that Mumia get off of death row and not have any further hearing or trial on his death sentence, because he recognized from his point of view that more publicity about Mumia would be detrimental, and they wanted him just to die in prison.
If anything, Ed Rendell is not stupid. And that probably also applies to his handling of this law. I was really surprised last year because it was almost sure that they would shoot themselves in the foot. Mm-hmm. And for once, what the FOP did backfired very badly.
Right, exactly. And Rendell, and they broke the deal. I mean, I don't have any proof of this deal, but I know that that's what there was. They broke the deal that they were supposed to have, which is to just keep their mouths shut and let Mumia do whatever he's going to do, and so long as that gets ignored, that'll be fine. And I say that because they ignored Long Distance Revolutionary. They ignored Manufacturing Guilt. They ignored the Veronica book that exposed Faulkner. They just kept their mouths shut about everything. And they went crazy over this Goddard graduation speech. So I think the Rendell's position sort of is telling over what was going on here. But I only come back to this to say that what happened in that decision, the decision that was made by Judge Connor, tossing out that law, the so-called re-victimization law, is very important for Mumia overall because it accepts and states point blank that Mumia was targeted. We all know that, but he put that in his decision, that he was targeted, that this law was specifically done to silence him.
Yes.
And all of these things put together just make it a very clear, powerful argument on one hand, not on one hand, but that in addition to everything else about Mumia's innocence and the frame up, is that this man is going to be targeted no matter what. And the life of this extreme medical mistreatment in the face of absolute evidence that there is a problem with Mumia's glucose level, his sodium level, his blood pressure level, that they thought that they could ignore this and let this man die, is just part of what goes on there.
I think that's a very powerful concluding word. So these are new arguments to demand that Mumia finally